Welcome back to the Investigator discussion series. I'm rather Incoherent, and this is Carolyn Fern. She's a rather atypical Guardian cluever with a bit of a support twist to it. She's mostly interesting because of her card pool, and while I would say that she has an atypical stat line for a Guardian, I burst out laughing the first time I said that and then went, let's get into the stat line. She has 3 in head and 2 in foot, which is like the most common Guardian stat line there is. Almost every Guardian's Mythos defense stats look exactly like this. I'm surprised to remember that Carolyn's are the exact same as Roland and Tommy. However, where she's different is that she has a 4 in book and a 2 in fist. This is actually less stats than other characters. Carolyn only gets 11 base stats, and I'm gonna be honest with you, Carolyn doesn't feel anywhere near strong enough to justify the missing base stat, but here we are. She has a 6/9 split of soak, which is actually 1 more point of soak than you would expect, and above average, so that's great. Her ability is reaction. After one of your card effects heals horror from an investigator or ally asset, the healed card's controller gains 1 resource. So if you're providing horror healing to yourself and your teammates, you will be generating resources to yourself and your teammates. In terms of team support, I personally don't value building with the intent of giving economy to other people as much. I think card draw is much more generally useful. I think economy, with the exception of a couple of really strong economy support cards like Crack the Case and Faustian Bargain, typically when a character's card is economy support, I tend to find that's far more economy support than you could ever need to give your teammates. I tend to see 1 Faustian Bargain or 1 Crack the Case be enough to give my teammates as many resources they could possibly have needed. So when you're drip feeding 1 resource per turn, so they're never getting a lot up front, it's only going to 1 person per turn, so in 3 and 4 players, the ability to help your team as a whole is not really scaling up in any meaningful way. And mainly just that, like, even if you gave it all to 1 person, it's not that useful to give this much resources to anyone. It's only really going to help Carolyn if Carolyn's feeding the resources into herself, and then she's basically getting a Jenny ability. But then I just don't like this sort of ability. I genuinely think that team support economy is one of the weakest forms of team support, and it's more that cards like Crack the Case and Faustian Bargain are insanely strong than team support economy being generally good. I say this as someone who, like, one of my first decks was a teamwork Charles Ross Esquire Jenny that wanted to pay for other people's stuff. Just giving economy to your teammates requires 1, your teammates to warp their decks to have bad economy and trust you to give them money, and 2, just isn't that strong in general, especially if they are not warping their decks. So even though this ability is not blank and it does do something, I do not think highly of it. Her star is +1, you may heal 1 horror from an investigator or ally asset at your location. So it's +1, heal a horror, give somebody a resource. Very, very good start. As a Guardian with 4 book, Carolyn needs good deck building options to thrive, and she has fantastic deck building options. She's Guardian 0 to 3, Neutral 0 to 5, cards that heal horror level 0 to 5, and up to 15 other Seeker and or Mystic cards level 0 to 1. That's just half of her deck between a Mystic and Seeker 0 to 1. That's a tremendous amount of flexibility in her card pool, and it allows her to play a very strong game as a cluever. I should also note she is not allowed to run weapons levels 1 through 5, and that makes the bullets on the back of the Guardian Investigator card particularly funny, since she's not supposed to be running this stuff. Coming over to her signatures, Hypnotic Therapy is pretty solid. It has 2 different uses. First, you can exhaust it to test book 2. If you succeed, you heal someone for a horror, then they're going to draw a card, and then your ability is going to trigger, potentially giving them a resource if you haven't done that already this turn. Then, separately, reaction after one of your other card effects, so not this first line, heals horror from an investigator, exhaust Hypnotic Therapy, that effect heals 1 additional horror. So whether you're using this as your method of triggering your ability and giving someone a draw, or you're using something else and this is just massively increasing the effectiveness of it, either way, Hypnotic Therapy is pretty solid. Rational Thought's a bit of a pain in the ass though. It goes in your threat area with 4 horror on it, and it can be healed as though it were on you. Once you get rid of all that horror, it goes away. But until you do, you cannot heal horror from anything else, and you no longer generate resources with your ability. Again, I don't like her ability very much, so that second part doesn't really bother me, but being unable to heal horror from your team when you're probably on your team specifically to heal horror is a bit of a pain in the ass. Again, not the hugest deal. 4 horror is not going to take you that long to get through. It's not gonna matter a ton. It's irritating when it comes into play consistently, but it never really does that much. It just prevents you from playing exactly the way you would have wanted. Carolyn also has alternate signatures, and I wish I could recommend them because I love Foolishness. This is a 4-cost ally asset. It's a 1/4 soak, but it comes into play with 3 horror on him. Horror may be healed as if it were on Carolyn, so anything that specifies an investigator still works on Foolishness. And once you heal all the horror on it, you get +1 to all skills. It gives you a way to trigger your horror healing if you have nothing else to target it with, which isn't necessarily going to be the case, but it also gives you a Omni stat boost. However, for cost, you have to heal the horror, and admittedly, you can sort of argue that like you're gonna heal the horror and get some of the resource costs back, so it's not as expensive as it looks. I like the idea of foolishness. I would love to play a deck with foolishness in it, but I can never justify running the paired weakness. To fight the Black Wind is so much harsher than rational thought. You attach it to the current agenda and you immediately take one direct horror. This barely matters. The important thing is at the end of the round, if any amount of horror was assigned to an investigator this round and it was not healed, place one doom on the attached agenda. That is actually pretty catastrophically bad. First of all, the fact it's going to take one direct horror means it's going to trigger this effect if you drew it in the upkeep phase, causing it to be ancient evils. Second, because the threat of this being in your deck exists, you sort of feel like you just have to always heal all the horror, which is kind of untenable. And when this comes into play, on some scenarios, it won't matter at all. That's just how the doom clock goes, right? But in many scenarios, this will be potentially multiple ancient evils, especially if it's a high horror scenario, which is the sort of scenario that makes you want to bring a Carolyn in the first place, right? So I really intensely dislike trying to play with Fight the Black Wind. Foolishness isn't even that good. I just personally really like the card. So I'm a big fan of going rational thought hypnotic therapy and then figuring out what the best sort of support package is for Carolyn to trigger horror healing and make use of this card pool. Getting into a deck core, this is a little bit too expensive and I really can't advocate for it as a deck core because a 39 experience deck with 12 experience of experience cards and a stick to the plan is a deck where I have like literally 20 experience of game warping effects in the deck. I would really love to play a Carolyn with Archive of Conduits, and when I've played Carolyn in the past, I have done this and I have recommended this, and my issue with it is basically, let me first explain why I think Archive of Conduits is worth running. It's not for healing horror. Typically, if you're on a team that has a Carolyn, you're on a team that is going to struggle against the mythos in some capacity and has bad soak. This also makes healing good, not just healing horror, but healing damage. So having Archive of Conduits is going to make it easier for you to save people from the mythos deck in general. Having a high draw deck that runs Archive in addition to your horror healing basically just says your teammates will not die. And that's really cool, that's really powerful, I like it a lot, but the experience creates a problem, right? The strongest proactive thing Carolyn can really do is Ancient Stones. You're going to resolve these usually with at least 7 secrets, sometimes more, usually 7's the number you aim for. Not gonna get into the process of researching these right now. The Minds and Harmony version of Ancient Stones says, reaction when you draw any number of cards, spend that many secrets, heal that much horror from a card at your location, which in conjunction with Field Agent, which is gonna boost your 4 book to a better number, and that's, you know, an important part of being an investigator that gets clues. Field Agent says, Lightning Bolt exhausts Field Agent and deal 1 horror to it, discover 1 clue at your location. So this is the clue version of Beat Cop, and it's generally less valuable because, well, there are less characters that want to use Book and Guardian, and this also has a worse soak than Beat Cop. If it were truly an equivalent Beat Cop, it would have 3 horror soak, and it does not have that, making it much harder to use. But having the Ancient Stones Field Agent combo allows you to essentially constantly burn your ability on yourself if no one else needs to be healed, keeping these guys going, and that's going to result in you getting a lot of Lightning Bolt clues over the course of a scenario. Beyond that, you have access to things like Dr. Milan, St. Hubert's Key, and Magnifying Glasses just to get reliably high book numbers, Safeguard to get free movement hacks. It's not Pathfinder, it's probably worse, but it costs 0, and it costs 1 less resource, and both of those are sort of a big thing. Cost 0 experience, I realize I misspoke. Over on the right, we have a pile of power cards that you would expect with this deck building, you know, from one of my decks at least. 2 Deep Knowledge, 2 Practice makes perfect, 1 shortcut to go under a stick to the plan, Deduction, Perception, Promise of Power, Take the Initiative. Just a bunch of things to make you Mythos resilient, help support your team, and generally get you through your deck faster and have more proactive value. By the way, this entire collection is Practice Makes Perfect, so the skills are really, really solid with PMP. But again, I can't really support this as a deck core. This is going to be your final deck in some campaigns. So coming down to a much more stripped down 26 experience deck, I've cut out the stick to the plan. I've gone up to emergency caches because I'm not going to be willing to run in Ever Vigilant if I don't have stick to the plan. And I've actually added in the second shortcut over the Archive of Conduits because as much as I want Archive of Conduits, I just look at the process of researching Ancient Stones, researching Archive of Conduits, spending multiple scenarios getting all of them upgraded, and the reality is they're not even the most important upgrade. Like, once you get Ancient Stones, you really want Field Agents and Charismas, and that Archive of Conduits just rots in your deck being useless for half a campaign. And realistically, I would rather, like, at 20 to 27 experience, just buy the level 0 Archive of Conduits outright and then research it and not have it crippling my deck for almost the entire campaign in some campaigns, right? So I think this is a much safer, more reasonable deck core, where the first thing you want to get is the Ancient Stones researched, then you want to get Field Agents and Charismas, and then from there, the world's really your oyster. You can't just get standing at a level 3, I'll always advocate for that. However, you can also go straight into Stick to the Plan to have a more consistent opening with Ever Vigilant and Emergency Cash. You can just buy the level 1 Archive of Conduits as soon as you've gotten the Field Agents, the Charismas, and the Ancient Stones. There's a lot of routes you can take this core, in terms of its upgrade path, I mean. And I guess since I'm talking about that so much, I really should show the level 0 deck, shouldn't I? It's just that there's so few cards in the core deck that really you can kind of piece together what the level 0 deck's gonna look like by and large. We're down a Field Agent and down an Ancient Stone. I bought one of each within the thick of it. Field Agent's just generally good. I'm fine to use it over Milan if I draw it first, and I need it very shortly once I get my Ancient Stones upgraded anyway. Ancient Stone, you want to start with 1 so you can research it in the first scenario ideally. The rest of the deck is basically identical, but because we're missing 2 cards, it seems like a great time to put in 2 copies of Guts. And I had to do a double take of the deck because so few cards change, but it's no good for Down the Rabbit Hole because the main thing is I just upgrade very few cards in general. Down the Rabbit Hole doesn't get very many uses. It still gets stacks on Ancient Stone, on Field Agent, on 2 copies of Charisma, and it gets me very little in exchange. But the level 0 Carolyn is still just basically the same deck. The horror healing is notably worse. In scenario 1, this character is not going to be healing horror very much at all. If your team needs you desperately to heal horror, then this Carolyn's not going to be good at that in scenario 1, because you are planning to upgrade into Ancient Stones immediately to do that, but the level 1 deck doesn't have anything doing this. This is because for me, I really don't think there are great methods of healing horror at level 1. If you have a team where you really feel like you have to heal horror in scenario 1, and they can't adjust their decks to give you the time to buy the better stuff, the sacrifice I would likely make is, Hallowed Mirror and cramming in more draw. There's just not great level 0 horror healing, and everything in the deck is a pretty big cost to cut already. A lot of the stuff that isn't healing horror right now is still team support, Deep Knowledge, Shortcut, Stand Together, Guts, Promise of Power. There's a lot of stuff in this deck that's either directly proactively doing your role, or it's able to be shared with your teammates if it's auxiliary, if it's fluff. So I have a really hard time recommending what to do for Carolyn Fern if your team needs horror healing in scenario 1. The way I tend to value Carolyn Fern is not that, oh, my character would die to horror, so can someone run Carolyn? Instead, the way I view Carolyn is, I don't need Carolyn to survive. Carolyn's going to help me with the weakness my character has and allow me to cut corners. Where previously I would have worked my deck building around something and really cared about the Mythos phase, Carolyn lets me more greedily pursue proactive things, and Carolyn will handle the defensive part of it, at least to some degree for me, but I'm not going to put all the pressure on Carolyn to solve my Mythos phase. Just trust her to make the Mythos notably easier in general. And I think that's where Carolyn's going to shine in most teams, is not when you have a Finn that just doesn't run any Mythos mitigation and trusts you to keep them alive, but instead when you run a Finn with minimal Mythos mitigation, starting off with a little bit and then maybe cutting some of it as they upgrade into new cards, and then Carolyn's the thing that's keeping them safe to be greedy, as opposed to just completely leaving it to Carolyn to keep you alive. I think that's too much pressure on Carolyn and bad team balance, but I do think it's worth letting Carolyn play the greedy, more proactive level 1 deck, and then upgrade into something that's genuinely very good at healing horror. And a huge part of that's just that Field Agents is so strong, Ancient Stones give you so much more horror healing than you need. The two combined work really well together as a proactive deck, and you only ever need to heal someone a little bit to keep them alive through scenarios has consistently been my experience. I've never seen someone eat like +4 health and then be scared. So if you're playing a Carolyn, your goal doesn't need to be heal 20 horror and make everyone live through everything. They can still do their own thing, they can still pass their own test, and you need to find a way to turn this into value when they don't need the horror healing. In that regard, that's Field Agent stuff. There's really not another great way to turn horror healing into value. Coming over to the tier list, I have Carolyn squarely at the top of my seed here. I think she's right on the cusp of strong. She tends to make people and teams she's in feel meaningfully safer to the Mythos phase, despite her relatively bad Mythos resilient stats at total 5, 3 head, 2 foot. She has Promise of Power, she has Take the Initiative, she has built-in tremendous horror healing, she's Mythos resilient. And the Mythos deck does more to you than just deal horror, so she's not going to make your team Mythos immune, she's just going to make them safer to the Mythos, which is valuable, but I don't really think it's like oh yeah, without Carolyn, you couldn't play a team of Charlie and Finn, but with Carolyn, these crazy characters have no weaknesses. I just think she makes them a little bit better against the mythos, able to be a little bit greedier in their deck building, a little bit more proactively powerful. I'm not super high on Carolyn's value as a team support. And again, I really don't particularly value Carolyn's ability to generate extra resources. I find that Guardian lacks ways to really translate that into tremendous value, and I find that my teammates consistently do not need the amount of economy support that Carolyn provides slowly over the course of a game, also irregularly and unpredictably. So I largely end up ranking Carolyn based on her proactive power, plus like some amount of spots, let's say 2 to 5, for the additional team support she's offering. I don't think it's nothing. I think the horror healing really doesn't matter. It's just I think there are so few characters that are genuinely afraid of horror damage to the point where having Carolyn fix it for you makes them tremendously better. It's really kind of just Roland. Everyone else feels like it's not a problem, and even Roland isn't that scared of horror unless he gets really unlucky and takes mental trauma unavoidably from his weakness at bad times. Proactively though, Carolyn is a character that has access to Safeguard for free movement, tons of free clues from the field agents being healed constantly just by the act of drawing during upkeep. Her deck can very easily boost her to 6+ book pretty immediately, 8 book eventually. She's got access to Practice Makes Perfect Deduction even though it's not leveled up. She has a lot of things that are proactively just very obviously strong as a cluever. You can do very cute stuff like converting your additional resources into value with Dynamite. It's cooler than it is good is my opinion of it. I love the deck to death, but I just don't know that it adds any power to the character. Unless you're playing a campaign with Swarming, then by all means bring Dynamite. But I just find that Carolyn's very transparently strong at playing a traditional clue game in addition to her support to the team. I think without any team support, she might rank mid C tier around Leo, around Vincent. But I think with the team support and just something I do need to cover, I suppose, is that the starting Carolyn deck is a pretty solid cluever. However, there's a lot of experience you really desperately want immediately. You want both copies of Ancient Stones, the second Field Agent, and the second Charisma. That's 5 plus 7 for the all but 1 experience of 2 Ancient Stones, right? That's 12 experience. The first 2 scenarios result in Carolyn spiking up pretty hard. She's a lot weaker in scenarios 1 and 2, which is not to say her scenario 1 is bad, just that it's nowhere near as good as a later game Carolyn. So largely what's keeping Carolyn down in C tier for me is that you can't really capitalize on the excess horror healing in the early scenarios for proactive value in the way that you'll be able to do it in scenarios 3 and onward in pretty much every campaign. I think Carolyn's just transparently good and deserves to be in B tier once we're talking about mid-campaign Carolyn. I think I would rank like a 15 experience Carolyn on par with a 15 experience Mandy Thompson. I think she gets much better with experience than a lot of characters. Her first 15 are great, and unlike some characters where the first 15 are crippling and mandatory, looking at you, Stella, for Carolyn, the first 15 just elevate her from being a pretty good deck to a really good deck. Comparing their power curves, actually, I would say that Carolyn is transparently better than Stella for the first 10 experience or so. A little bit better until you have about 15 experience. And even though Carolyn's spiking up during that time by like 20 experience, Stella has spiked up substantially harder than Carolyn will. And I think it's really just like the back half of a campaign getting Stella so much higher than Carolyn. I think there's an argument that I'm being too harsh on Carolyn, and that the same arguments that move Stella down deserve to move Carolyn up. But if I had to move somebody because of that, I'd be more inclined to drop Stella to here than to move Carolyn up, I think. I'm not like super opposed to a Carolyn in C tier. I don't think that I have Preston in the right spot. That's one of the things I'm realizing as I go back and forth is I think Stella's closer to Carolyn and Preston's not in this conversation. I think Preston's better than either of them. It makes sense that I have Stella and Carolyn very close to each other on either sides of a border. They both have very important early experience. They're both playing somewhat atypical versions of Cluevers. And I think I'm happy with Carolyn at the top of my C tier. I really want to rank her higher. I'm a sucker for support characters. I just really enjoy playing janky, powerful support things. It's why one of my favorite recent decks was pure support Harvey, where I was just making my fighter Leo find every single piece of shotgun support in the game and letting him run the greediest deck possible. It's why I love Bestow Resolve Mark so much as well. Daryl and Gloria are at the top of my tier list. I really value team support as both a metagame optimization analysis thing, but also it's just my playstyle. So I really want to rank Carolyn higher, But just like with Vincent, there are things holding Carolyn down. Her base 4 is not particularly impressive. Her mythos stats require work to be good. The mythos deck does more than deal horror, and her team support is ultimately not that valuable. But for now, I think I've rambled enough. I've talked about a lot of characters near Carolyn. I think comparing her directly to Alessandra, who she's above, I should do. Honestly, I tried. My opinion on Alessandra might mirror a lot of any direct comparisons to Kohaku, where I dislike Armageddon so much. That's a big part of why I dislike the way I played Alessandra so much. Alessandra definitely deserves to be circled back to, because she's a character where there are builds of her that are not Power Word. Power Word is a problem, even though it was incredibly strong, and it is also the problem the deck was bound to, and she felt like she was put under a ceiling by Power Word. Also though, just like Armageddon super random, Power Word super random. So when I try to compare anyone to Alessandra or Kohaku, I'm like, well, they aren't random, and it's just a tremendous personal bias that fucks up my ability to directly compare. So I'm gonna call it here. I've been Rather Incoherent. This has been where I'm at on Carolyn Fern. I really wish her team support was more valuable to teams. I just don't find the horror healing and the resources to genuinely be that impactful. It allows your teammates to cut some corners. It doesn't really make them that much better. And in terms of the proactive strength she has, she's pretty good. She's almost strong. I want to be clear, top of C tier tends to crush campaigns. If you have Fighter, Leo, Cluever, Carolyn, you're going to steamroll a campaign. It's not going to be that hard. It's only like the bottom of C tier down that really might start having problems in a campaign. So even though I'm not hot on Carolyn, Carolyn's still going to crush campaigns. C tier in an investigator relative sense is not necessarily bad. When I say fine, I mean fine. But yeah, I've got nothing else to say. I've been Rather Incoherent. Thank you for your time. If you made it this far, then please do hit all the buttons to make the algorithm happy. I greatly appreciate it. And I cannot overstate my gratitude towards the people supporting this channel, both as channel members here on YouTube and patrons over on Patreon. I'll see all of you in the next one.